In the history and folklore of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church, one of the best known and most beloved of the church officials of the second generation was J. Golden Kimball. A whole cycle of stories cluster about him, and wherever you go in the Mormon country, you find someone who will enjoy telling you some of these J. Golden stories. J. Golden was born in 1853 and died in 1938 at the age of 85. He was the son of Heber C. Kimball, who was one of the early day 12 apostles of the church and was Brigham Young's first counselor. J. Golden was 6 feet 3 inches tall, 75 inches tall, and as thin as a toothpick, and he had a high, squeaky voice to match his figure. One day as he was walking across the street in Salt Lake City, there by the Temple block, walking with his cane, a couple of teenagers in a hot rod whizzed down the street and just ticked him as they turned the corner and went off down the street, and old Brother Golden shook his cane at him and he said, "You son of a bitch! Have you no respect for the priesthood?" Somebody said, "Brother Golden, you're one of the authorities of the church. The authorities of the church are supposed to have visions. Have you had any visions?" "Hell no. But I've had some damn good nightmares." One day he said, "Those temple logs, we had some oxen. And those oxen were a little lazy. They wouldn't pull. I had a team of oxen that just stood there and looked at me. Well, it was just after the manifesto on swearing, but I got mad. And I cussed those oxen up one side and down the other. And boy, did they get in and begin to pull. But then they were church oxen and they understood the language." The church authorities worried about his swearing in the tabernacle when he'd get up to preach. And on one occasion, the president of the church, Heber J. Grant, wrote a speech out for Brother Golden to deliver. It came his turn, and he was trying to read the speech. And right in the middle of it, he stopped, and he turned around, and he says, "Hell, Heber, I can't read this damn thing." One day he went across the street. It was a nice Sunday morning, and his neighbor, with whom he was very friendly, lived across the street, and Brother Golden said, "Hey, some son of a bitch stole my lawnmower. I wonder if it's over here." He often talked about his health. Health was of some concern to him. And in one of his sermons, he was telling about a friend. He said, "He's in a pretty bad fix. But I suppose he'll live longer than any of us at that. You know, all you have to do to live a long time is just get yourself an incurable disease and take care of it." He often was called upon to preach funeral sermons, and one day he went to Idaho, a town in southern Idaho, to preach the funeral sermon for a man that he thought he had known pretty well. He was a little late getting there, and when he arrived, the funeral service was already going on. So he came into the church by the back way, and he got up on the platform and joined the other speakers there. And he looked down, and there was the coffin in front of the pulpit there, and the audience were listening and very attentive. And it came Brother Golden's turn to speak. So he got up and he praised the good brother, and he told the audience what a fine father he had been and what a fine member of the church he had been, and how he had always paid his tithing and gone to church. And he noticed a certain squirming around in the audience. Then he looked down, and there, sitting on the 5th row, was the very man he was talking about. So he stopped and he turned around and he said, "Hey, Bishop, who the hell's dead around here anyway?" Once he said, "I like to preach a man's funeral sermon while he's living. You can't tell the truth about a man after he's dead. Why, I've given many a man a ticket to the celestial glory that I knew damn well wouldn't take him more than halfway." One day a friend said, "Brother Golden, when you die, I wish you would go to the other side and look up my father. He's been dead several years, and I know he'd be glad to see you." "No, I won't do that. When I get to the other side, I'm going to be busy, and I don't want to look all over hell for your father." He was in San Francisco one day preaching a funeral sermon, and he was describing the great virtues and talents of the man who had died. And he concluded, "I know he was a good man. He paid his tithing regularly. He sent his sons on a mission for the church. He lived the gospel. And what's more, brothers and sisters, I know he was a good man. He always read the Deseret News, and it takes a damn good man to do that." Sometimes he had to sit through the conferences and wait his turn to speak. The people knew of the danger of letting him speak, and sometimes it never did come his turn. On one occasion, he had been sitting there for 3 days, and finally he did get up. He said, "I've been hanging on the hook so long during this conference, I'm nearly worn out. I had some wonderful thoughts for you, but they've all oozed out of me by now. When I came into the tabernacle yesterday, I was met by one of my old friends. He said, 'Why, hello, Golden, I thought you were dead.' Now, I want to notify all my friends that I'm not dead. I know it's a hard time getting that way, but when I die, I want a brass band, lots of noise. People will say, 'What's that? Who's dead?' Why, Kimball's dead. And then they'll know that I'm all right." His sermons always were well attended, and they were well enjoyed. He had a unique way of getting the attention of his audiences. On one occasion in southern Idaho, he and the president of the church, Heber J. Grant, were speaking to the ladies' auxiliary. There were about 300 women in the audience, and it was a warm afternoon. President Grant had just given a long statistical report on the condition of the church, and all the ladies were asleep. So Brother Golden got up and he said, "My dear sisters, there's not one man in 1,000 who knows how to treat a woman right." And they woke up because they thought they were going to hear something good. And he went on and he said, "And I want to add that there's not one woman in 1,000 who knows when she's being treated right." Another time, he had a group of young people in his audience, and he came to the pulpit, and he stood towering above it for a long, silent minute. And then he leaned forward and pointed his finger at them, and he said, "Go to hell! Go to hell! That's where you go if you don't change your ways." And then he preached them a pretty good sermon. One day in the tabernacle, he said, "I can never speak in this tabernacle unless I'm under the influence of the Holy Ghost." Another time he said, "I'm happy this morning. I'm just as happy as a man can be with rheumatism." One day he was talking to one of the men's auxiliary groups, and he said, "How
how many of you men in this room would lay down your lives for your church?
And every hand went up.
All right. Now, how many of you will donate 50 cents to the 70s fund?
So they all had to kick in. Once he said,
If I had $1 million, I'd be the most sought-after man in this church. But I haven't got it, damn it.
One day at a men's priesthood meeting, he said,
When I look over this body of men, I don't see that you're particularly distinguished. You don't look much better than I do, and I'm only a remnant of what I ought to be.
One evening, just before going to church, Brother Golden was all dressed up in his fine Sunday best with his silk hat and his silk vest and his fine trousers. But he remembered that the calf had not been fed. And so he went in and got a bucket of milk that had just been brought in from the barn. And he took this warm, sudsy milk out to where the calf was. And he put it down in front of the calf, and the calf jammed its nose down into the bucket, of course, clear to the bottom, took a big drink, and then the calf raised its head and shook foamy milk suds all over Brother Golden's fine Sunday clothes. And Brother Golden said,
If I wasn't trying to live my religion, if I wasn't trying to hold my temper, if I wasn't trying to give up swearing, I'd take your goddamn head and push it through the bottom of this bucket.
Somebody said, Brother Golden, people always laugh at you. Do you intend to be funny?
No, I don't. I don't expect to say those things, but they just come out. Take Brother Ballard, for instance. Now, he can say the same thing I do, and people like it. He can get up in the tabernacle and he can say, Brothers and sisters, I have not prepared a sermon for you today. The Lord will put the words into my mouth, and only the Lord has an idea as to the message that I will bring. And then he'll go ahead and preach them a fine sermon, and they'll love it. I can get up and say the same thing. Brothers and sisters, God only knows what I'm going to tell you. They all laugh.
One day his nephew said, Uncle Golden, I just heard a new Jay Golden story. Do you want to hear it?
No, I don't. Seems like every time anything happens, they blame it on me or Mae West.
He always liked to eat his lunches downtown in Salt Lake City at the rotisserie. He liked to eat with a group of lawyers who were there frequently. And on this particular day, he was seated at the end of the table, and the lawyers were seated around the table. The waiter came to his end to take Brother Golden's order first. And the waiter wrote the order down, and then the waiter said, What will you drink? Well, now, a good member of the church was not supposed to drink tea or coffee. And so Brother Golden said,
Water.
And someone next to him said to the waiter, Oh, he likes coffee. Bring him coffee. So the waiter wrote down coffee, and Brother Golden watched him and didn't say a word until the waiter got way around to the other end of the table, and then he said,
The Lord heard me say water.
Brother Golden had quite a lot to say about marriage. One day he said,
I've often wondered what would happen if the perfect man married the perfect woman. I'll bet he'd shoot her within a week if she didn't poison him first.
One day he said,
This is the month of June. I'm reminded that it's the mating season. I want to tell you, young people, not to expect too much of your mate when you get married. When I got married, I thought I was marrying an angel. There were many times I wished the hell I had. Another time he said, I want to give you young people some advice on how to pick a wife. I know of one man who picked a wife because she was beautiful. Another picked a wife because she could cook. I once knew a man who picked a wife because she could sing. He married her. He took her home. The next morning when he looked at her, he saw part of her hair over on the dresser and her teeth in a glass and parts of her strung around the room, and he looked at her again and he said, sing, for hell's sake, sing. Senator Reed Smoot was also a member of the 12 Apostles of the Mormon Church, and he spent many years in Washington. His wife died there, and as the years went by, he found himself getting lonely, and he decided to take a younger wife, member of his office staff there, and she was a young woman, and he didn't think it would be quite right for him to take another wife without clearing with the authorities of the church back in Salt Lake. And so one day when he was back in the church office building, he went in to see President Grant about it. And President Grant said, why, Reed, I think that's a good idea. I think you need a young wife. It'll wake you up and bring new life to you, and I would approve. And what's more, I'll be glad to give you my blessing. So Senator Smoot was very pleased, and as he was striding out of the church office building, he met Brother Golden at the door coming in. And they greeted each other, and Senator Smoot said, by the way, Golden, I've been talking with Brother Heber about my forthcoming marriage. He's going to give me his blessing. What do you think of it? Well, Reed, I don't know about that, Reed, now. I don't know about that. You must remember that she's a young woman, and you're an old man, or fast getting that way, and she'll expect more from you than just the laying on of hands. One day up in southern Idaho, he was preaching a sermon, and the bishop had told him that some of the boys were getting a little wild, and asked him whether he would say a few words that might calm the boys down. So Brother Golden was preaching his sermon, and about halfway through he remembered what the bishop had asked. So he stopped right in the middle of what he was saying, and he said, by the way, the bishop tells me that some of you young bucks are getting a little too wild up here. He says you're carrying 6-shooters around in your hip pockets. I want you to be careful. The damn things might go off and blow your brains out. One warm spring Sunday morning, he was preaching in a small southern Idaho town, and he felt good, and the audience felt good, and Brother Golden was carried away. He began to tell them what a wonderful town they had, and he promised them that if they lived the gospel, that this town should grow. It would become a metropolis of trade. It would become very prosperous. Temples of learning would rise. The railroads would come, and the desert there would blossom as the rose, and the people loved it. And then after the sermon was over, he was supposed to take dinner with the bishop, but the bishop couldn't find him anywhere. They looked all around, and finally, out in the barn was Brother Golden pounding his head against a stall. Why, Brother Golden, the chicken dinner's ready. Come on in. We're waiting for you. What's the matter? I shouldn't have said it. I shouldn't have done it. I was carried away. There's not one damn chance in hell of it's ever coming true. He was speaking to a small, intimate group of friends once, and he said, I believe that the age of miracles is not past. The Lord does speak to us in these latter days, That was proved to me when Brother Richard was chosen to be a member of the 12 apostles. Only God would have chosen him. No human being in his right mind would have picked him. One day he said, "You young fellows, I want to advise you to go down to the patriarch and have your patriarchal blessing and find out what's in store for you if you live the gospel the way you should." When I was a boy, I did. I went down and had my patriarchal blessing. And the patriarch put his hands on my head, and he said, "Brother Golden, verily I say unto you, you will live the gospel. You will become a pillar of the church. You will preach the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And the church will be proud of you. Verily I say unto you that you are truly your Father's son." Now that's always been a great comfort to me. One day he said, "This church is supposed to have a prophet, seer, and revelator in these latter days, which is our prophet, and he's supposed to bring us revelations from God. I wish to hell he'd get on the job. Trouble is, he travels so damn fast, the Lord can't catch up with him." One Sunday morning in southern Utah, he had delivered what he thought was a pretty good sermon, and afterwards all the people were standing at the door to congratulate him, all except one woman who stood out by the front gate by a little ditch bank there. And he went out and she said, "Brother Golden, I've got to say this. I must get it off my chest. I hope you'll forgive me, but I don't like the way you church authorities come down here and speak to us." "What's the matter, sister?" "Well, you come down here and you talk to us as if you were the Lord Almighty himself. And I resent that a little. The miracles of the Lord we like to reserve for the Lord. Look at this beautiful tree. Only God could make this. And look at this green grass. And this lovely stream of water here. These are things which the Lord can do, not you church authorities." "Well, you may be right, sister. I couldn't make that tree, and I couldn't make the grass, but I'll take you up on the water." One day he said, "I believe in being honest, true, chaste, benevolent, and virtuous, and doing good at all times. What can you do with a man who is a cheat and a liar? You can baptize him every 10 minutes, but it won't do him any good unless you hold him under." One day a friend said, "Brother Golden, you old reprobate, I'm going up to the church office and tell them on you, and they'll cut you off the church." "Go ahead. Go and tell them. I suppose there are some who would like to cut me off the church, but they can't do it. I repent too damn fast." One day, as he was getting old and feeble and hobbling down the street in Salt Lake, somebody said, "Brother Golden, how are you?" "Well, I can't piss. But I shouldn't complain. The president of the church, he can't piss either." Another time somebody said, "How are you, Brother Golden?" "I'm not long for this world, but I don't mind. In fact, I'm rather looking forward to going to the other side. Maybe I'll find out if there's any truth to what I've been preaching all these years." And so when Brother J. Golden Kimball died, the church lost one of the most colorful and most universally loved of its leaders. In the early days of the LDS Church, that is the Mormon Church in Utah, there was a great wave of immigration of newly converted church members from Northern Europe, particularly from the Scandinavian countries.
Brigham Young sent most of the Scandinavians to the same region in southern Utah so they could be together. That's how it happens that in one or two counties, particularly in Sanpete County in Utah, the population is predominantly Scandinavian, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. A generation or two ago, Danish was readily understood, and many old-timers still speak Danish, or they speak English with a strong Danish accent. And they used to like to tell yarns about themselves, and this pleasant pastime produced a whole cycle of stories that we call the Brother Peterson stories. One day a young man got off the train in Ephraim, and he asked an old-timer sitting there, he said, can you tell me where Peter Larson is? Oh, do you know Peter Larson? Yes, I'm a literal descendant of old Peter Larson. Oh, well, so you are a literal descendant of Peter Larson? I don't understand quite. What is this literal business? Well, the fellow said, you know what literal means, a literal descendant. The cat has kittens, and the kittens are a literal descendant of the cat. Or old sow has pigs, and they're its descendant. Oh, now I know what you mean here. It's when they come in litters. The people of one of those Scandinavian towns were very eager to get the railroad. And they pulled all the political wires they could, and they promised the railroad company just about everything. And finally, the railroad came through, and the old farmers turned out with their scrapers and their teams to help build the railroad. And finally, it was working, and everybody was happy. But old Brother Peterson's cow one day wandered over on the track, and the train struck her, and she was killed. So the adjuster came around to talk to Brother Peterson about the cow and the value of the cow and the value of the accident. And finally, they agreed. The adjuster said, I think this accident should be worth about $50, don't you? And Brother Peterson agreed that it should. And so the adjuster went away. And when he came back, he brought a voucher. Only it was not for $50, it was for $100. He had been thinking about it, and he thought how good a cow it was and how fine the old man had been about the accident. And so he handed him the voucher, and the old man says, what is it, this voucher business now? You tell me, what is this voucher? And why is it $100? Well, the adjuster said, I think that this accident should be worth $100. Although we did agree on 50. No, sir, the old Dane said. I know that was a very valuable cow, and I'm very sorry that this thing happened, and I am sorry to put the railroad company to all this trouble. But we agree on $50, and I will not pay you a cent more. In one of the small towns near some timberland, an old Swede brought the first mechanical circle saw into the community, and he was very proud of it. And he liked to demonstrate the efficiency of this power saw to the boys as they stood around. And he got the blade going, and he started pushing blocks through one after another, and the boys leaned over his shoulder to watch him push the blocks through. And he got to going a little too fast, and he got a little bit out of synchronization, and he got his finger in front of the blade, and he cut a finger off. And the fellow said, well, you darn fool, you careless fellow, you deliberately put your finger in front of that saw. And the old Swede said, he did not. All he done was just like this, and oops, there goes the other one. One night the city council was arguing about putting a fence around the cemetery. And the old Swede got up and he says, well, now here we are talking about this thing. I don't think we should have a fence around the cemetery anyways. After all,
them that is in there, they can't get out, and them that is on the outside, they don't want to get in, so that don't leave us much to speculate on, does it? There was one old Swede who lived in polygamy. He had 2 wives, and he gained for himself a reputation far and wide for treating both of those wives exactly alike. Now, in polygamy, this was not easy to do, and many people were unhappy because of unequal treatment among the wives. But this particular old Swede enjoyed his reputation. Every time he would buy a new dress for one wife, he would buy a new dress for the other that cost just as much. If he bought a horse and buggy for one, he would buy a horse and buggy for the other. And as the years went on, his reputation grew greater and richer. And then one day, one of his wives took sick and died. They took her to the cemetery, and she was buried there in the little family plot in which there was room for 3 graves, and she was put on one side. Then, for some inexplicable reason, in a few weeks, the second wife sickened and died, and they took her to the cemetery and put her in the little family plot on the other side, leaving the space in the middle for the good brother. Well, it wasn't long after that until he became ill, and it was decided that he was on his deathbed too. And his friends came around to see what they could do for him, and the bishop came in to see if there was some last request. And the old Swede looked up at him and he says, "Yeah, sure, Bishop, there is one thing. I would like to ask just a little favor between you and me. You know, in a day or 2 I will die, and you will take me out to the cemetery and bury me there between my 2 wives. Well, just as a little favor to me, tilt me a little towards Tilly." There was an old a gentleman who had not been accustomed to public speaking, and he had not been an official of the church before, was elected to be the bishop. And it was his job, of course, to perform the marriage ceremonies, and he had never done this. But he decided that now was the time to try, especially since he had a young couple standing before him waiting to get married. The audience were there waiting, and the young couple stood in front of him, and so he braced himself and he said, "Now, brothers and sisters, we are gathered here in all solemnity to lock up in holy wedlock this young couple. Brother John August Anderson, do you take Sister Helena Ganetta Rhodes for sickness and complaining and all that?" "You do?" Brothers and sisters, he say he do. "Sister Helena Ganetta Rhodes, do you take John August Anderson for staying out late nights and spending the family money and for worse and more of it?" "You do?" Brothers and sisters, he say, she do. "Now, will you please take hands?" No, I didn't say shake hands. I say take hands. You're a little excited, so am I. You will get better acquainted after a while. That's all right. Now, if there is anyone within the sounding of my voice which have any reason why this young couple should not get married, let him forever shut up. And so now, by all the authority under my vest, I pronounce you Papa and Mama for time and maternity. One day the bishop was waited upon by old Sister Hansen and Brother Jorgensen. They wanted to get married. She was 78 and he was about 80. And the bishop asked them why they wanted to get married at this time in life. And they explained that each of them had a certain amount of property and no one had anyone to leave it to, and they would like to get married and have an heir to leave their property to, besides having some company for their old age. And the bishop looked at them for a moment and he says, well, now, my dear friends, I want to say just one thing here. He says, you may be air-minded, but you ain't air-conditioned. One old fellow, he said, he says, when my old wife, Sarah, she died, I was very sad. I couldn't get over it. And I would go out with the sheep, and I wouldn't have my family prayers. And I turned lukewarm water on the church, and I was very unhappy. And then comes down Brother Nephi Jensen from Salt Lake. He was the first of the church authorities to circumcise the globe. And he comes down and he says to me, you know what you need? He says, you need to take you a nice young new wife. Oh, I love that man. Old Sister Larson one day was praising her dead husband. She says, he was a good man to me all my life. We were married many years, and he treats me so good, and he don't work me too hard. I remember even when I was out pitching the hay, and I ran the pitchfork through my arm, and he told me, go home and take the afternoon off. One day an old man called his son in, and he says, Hans, I'm worried about you. You have been, so I'm told, seeing a lot about with that Hanson girl who lives over in Salina. Yes, Dad, I've been seeing her. Well, I want to remind you that there's a lot of gossip about her. She's a wild girl. I have heard that she have slept with all the boys in Salina. Hell, Dad, Salina ain't such a big town. One day in one of the towns in San Pete County, there was to be an ecclesiastical trial. It seems that Brother Larson had been a little too attentive to Sister Peterson while her husband was away on a mission. And this was a bad thing. And if guilty, Brother Larson would face excommunication from the church. Brother J. Golden Kimball happened to be down there at the time, and so they asked him to sit in and listen to the church trial as it proceeded. And the bishop was asking Brother Larson the questions. And he said, Brother Larson, it's been testified that you've been a little too attentive to Sister Peterson while her husband was away on a mission. Well, yes, Bishop, that I have. I have been a good friend to her, and that is all right. I think I'm not guilty of anything wrong. And the bishop said, well, it's been testified that you've been seen at her house coming out of her back door at all hours of the night. Well, now, Bishop, I come over to do the chores like a good neighbor should, and sometimes it take a long time to do the chores, and it's all right if I come out at all hours of the night. I don't do nothing wrong. Well, the bishop said it was testified that you were seen coming out of her house at 6 and 7 in the morning. You'd been there all night. Well, now, Bishop, maybe I have to be there all night sometimes. But you know it takes a long time to do the chores, and I am not guilty of this bad thing which you accuse me of, not at all. Well, the bishop said, you know that it's been testified that somebody was passing by the window and looked in and saw you in bed with Sister Peterson. What do you say about that? Well, now, Bishop, maybe somebody do walk by the window, and maybe they do look in and see me in bed with Sister Peterson. But I want to deny this awful thing which you charged me of. I didn't do nothing wrong, and I'm not guilty. And just then old Brother J. Golden unwrapped his legs and stretched, and he said, I move that we excommunicate the brother. It's obvious that he does not have the seed of Israel in him.
There had been a long dry spell in one of the southern Utah towns, and finally it was decided that they should meet one Sunday and pray for rain. And one after another they prayed, and finally it came Brother Peterson's turn, and he got up and he says, "Brothers and sisters, we are gathered here on this great occasion to ask the Lord's great blessing. We are here to pray for rain. As we make this prayer, we must remember the blessings of the Lord on our ancestors, our forefathers, and our foremothers too, and how the Lord answered their prayers as they came across the plains. But I want to say one thing. If our prayers should not be answered, it would not be the fault of the Lord. It would be our own weakness of faith. And we must have faith, because we can't do these things without faith. Only the Lord has the power to do these great things. After all, the bishop, he can't make water. Sister Hansen can't make water. Brother Olson can't make water. Sister Jorgensen can't make water. You can't make water. I can't make water. This we must leave up to the Lord and His Son Jesus Christ. And another time on Testimony Day in church, the folks were telling about how good it felt to live the religion. And one old lady got up and told her that she never drank tea or coffee or anything stronger, and she had good health. Her stomach was in perfect condition, and this was more than she could say for some members of the congregation. And she looked right at Brother Peterson. And so he got up, and he says, "Brothers and sisters, I feel that I must say a word or two here, because I am the one which was meant. And I want to admit that it is true that sometime I do drink coffee and tea, and sometime I drink things that are a little bit stronger than tea or coffee, but it haven't hurt my health none. I want to say now that my stomach is all right, and I want to tell Sister Jorgensen that I will put my stomach up against hers any day." In one small town, a couple of old-timers lived out on the edge of town together, and they spent many an hour talking about the philosophy of life and the hereafter. And they made an agreement that when one should die, he would go to the other side and find out what it was all about, and he would come back in a dream or vision and tell the survivor what it looked like in the hereafter. And in exchange for this favor, the survivor was supposed to preach the finest funeral sermon that had ever been preached. Well, time passed, and one of them died. And the survivor had to preach the sermon. Probably the wrong one died, because the survivor hadn't had any experience preaching funeral sermons, but he had to go through with it. So the corpse was laid out in front, and the congregation were ready. And the old man got up and he says, "Brothers and sisters, we are now come here to pay our last, to say a few words anyway, for our departed friend here. Now he have left our great company, and he have gone to the great behind. He have gone now to dwell among the holy angles. What we see lying here before us is only the shell. The nut hath flew the coop." But I want to say to you now that he was not a bad man. He be criticized for not coming to church, and he drank too much, and he swear too much, and all that. But I want to tell you one thing. He was not always as bad as he sometimes was. And so now he hath gone, and I want to say that he come from a fine long line of descendants. His great-grandfather, he fought in the battle where the Bull Run. And his grandfather, he was a veteran of the Black Hawk War, and his grandmother, she was a veteran of the Night Hawk War. And I want to tell you, he was a grand old veterinary himself. And another time, the old Dane said, "You know,
my mother-in-law, she was very sick. And we have all the doctors in, and in spite of everything they do, she continued to improve. And so one day she says to me, "How would you like to help me plan my funeral?" "Yeah, that I would," I says. "I sure would like that." And so we go in and we sit down on the overly stuffed furniture there. And we talk about the funeral and who should offer the opening benediction, and which of the uncles should preach and who should be the polar bears. And then she says to me, "Now I want you should pick the closing song." Well, now I don't know nothing about songs for church. All I know is, "Where is my wandering boy this evening?" and "I won't go home till tomorrow," and songs like that. And then it comes to me right out of the blue, and if that ain't an inspiration, I don't know what it isn't. "God be with you if we ever meet again."